Okay. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure. I'm here to commend your efforts, to join you on this journey that you're all on towards sustainability, and because we have a broader international context to share with you. I'm really pleased to be here, I have to say. I've been working in the sustainable tourism field for many years, and the fact that I'm here as your keynote speaker today really tells me that sustainable tourism is having a moment, and an important moment. And I'd like to really thank you for having me here, and I hope to share some experience with you that's valuable, and also to learn from you all throughout the day. So you all know that the quality tourist is the theme of our summit. And I certainly support the move to focus on quality over quantity. This makes a lot of sense. But I think it's important that we dive more deeply into what exactly do we mean by quality. Is this a quality tourist? Is that? Is that? Are they? Are they? Perhaps the answer is not so simple as it initially appears, and we'll come back to this throughout my talk. So most destinations, even those who say otherwise, are still hung up on chasing volumes of tourists and growing the amount of money that tourists spend. And this makes sense. This has been the mandate for a long time. This is where the funding comes from. Destinations have traditionally had a marketing mandate to bring in more visitors, to get them to spend more money, to generate jobs, to generate business. We all know that revenue has been key for a long time. And everyone knows the economic benefits of tourism, right? There's been plenty of research. We can all probably quote the same statistics from UNWTO, from WTTC. We understand that tourism creates jobs, creates investments, creates entrepreneurship. We know that. But all industries have costs, don't they? And can anyone here in this room explain what the costs are of tourism? Can anyone give the same level of detail that we all can on the, let's say, the positive side of the ledger about what tourism costs? Do we know if tourism can actually recover its costs in a destination? No one knows what it actually costs to host visitors. Therefore, we don't know if tourism actually pays for itself in a community. And can you imagine running your own business this way? I think about this all the time. Imagine if you only reported on your revenue. Last year we made 3 million. So what? Do we know what the costs were of running that business? But we do know that destinations are struggling around the world to manage growth in tourism. In the Netherlands, of course, we all know about the challenges with over-tourism in places like Amsterdam, in Giethoorn, in Kinderrijk. Sorry if I didn't pronounce correctly. But there's many examples of destinations all around the world dealing with these challenges, and it's not all related to over-tourism. What we are dealing with is an imbalance of costs versus benefits. So this is why we commissioned research last year with Cornell University and Eplerwood International to dig into this issue, to better understand not just what's happening in tourism, but what are the root causes and the potential solutions that can help us to address this issue of costs, this issue of understanding better the burdens of tourism. What we found, in a nutshell, is that the range of costs that are being incurred by destinations, and importantly, the taxpayers, the residents in communities, often without compensation, are really making a difference in destinations, and we call this the invisible burden of tourism.
International tourism is rising and fast. In 2018, arrivals reached 1.4 billion. While tourism can bring economic development and other benefits, it also brings a range of hidden costs. Wherever it exists, tourism places an invisible burden on destinations. On the face of it, tourism pays its way. Tourists spend their money on local services, and businesses pay local taxes and utility bills. But many costs are not accounted for, such as the cost to upgrade infrastructure beyond resident needs to meet tourism demand, the cost to manage and protect public spaces and natural habitats, the cost of increased exposure to climate change risks, and and the cost to locals of rising house and land prices driven by the demand from tourism. Either residents are left to pick up the tab, or it's just not paid, leaving the environment and other public assets to suffer. When visitor numbers are low, the invisible burden goes largely unnoticed. But as tourism grows, every new visitor brings unanticipated costs to the destination. As the invisible burden escalates, destinations become spoiled and residents protest or are forced to leave. Failing to account for tourism's invisible burden puts fragile ecosystems, cultural wonders, and community life at risk. This puts tourism on a weak foundation that could crack under its own weight. But it doesn't have to be this way. Destinations need our attention and resources. Dynamic leadership, new talent, investment platforms, and analysis of the invisible burden will benefit visitors and residents alike, now and for generations to come. Find out more by reading the report at invisibleburden.org.
So let's talk for a few minutes about some of the costs of tourism. There are many. We know that there are costs incurred by residents when it comes to maintaining and upgrading municipal infrastructure and public assets related to water, energy, waste, transportation. Tourism businesses are used to paying taxes and parts of revenue for amenities, but there are still many costs that are borne by residents and communities. The cost of expanding infrastructure, particularly to service peak season demand in destinations, is often a cost that's borne by residents in places, and sometimes they don't even realize it. In Rhodes, the island in Greece, in 2013, a new oil-fired power plant was built strictly to service the tourism industry and the growing tourism industry that took place there. Since 2013, residents of Rhodes have paid €1.35 per tourist night to subsidize the cost of building this power plant. That's a total of €23 million since 2013, and it's locked the people of Rhodes into another generation of dependency on fossil fuels. Just one small example of the overall cost being borne by the community. There are costs related to the environment, to natural resources and biodiversity. There have been many examples around the world of destinations having to close special spaces. We've seen this in Thailand, in Iceland, in the Philippines, because of real risk to these iconic places, these beaches, these beautiful natural resources that everyone loves. And there are many costs which often are really hard to quantify related to social and cultural degradation and conflict. This is the area most often associated with over-tourism. So crowds, escalating housing prices, in fact, housing crises in some communities, rise in cost of living, locals leaving historic centers because they've become shopping malls essentially for tourists, a way of life under threat. These costs are either being paid for by the residents or simply not being paid at all, and this puts our tourism assets at major risk for the long term. You know, if we are not able to protect these assets, if no one is willing to cover the costs and think more critically about what's happening to these assets, we are very concerned about what's going to happen in tourism over generations. So what does the invisible burden mean in terms of pursuing the quality tourist? So clearly a quality tourist would very simply cover his or her full costs of staying, right? So they would provide more benefits to the host community than they would costs. This way we can say that they add value to the destination. And it's tempting to see quality as high value. Many destinations do this in pursuit of, for example, the luxury tourist. So destinations build golf courses and marinas with the idea of attracting big spenders, right? So the hope is that you can increase value without having to increase volume. And great, that sounds really good on paper. But where does the money go? That's one of the questions, right? So does the money just go towards high-end luxury goods that are imported from elsewhere? Maybe from China, as we heard in our opening. Does the money all go to large hotel brands that are owned by foreign investors? So this concept of economic leakage, the money actually just leaving the destination, is a real concern. Luxury tourists are also higher consumers, so they consume 3 to 4 times more water per day than a permanent resident does. And the higher the star rating of a hotel, typically the greater the consumption of water and energy. It's also tempting to think about, for example, the cultural tourist as one that could provide value. But the question is, how do we know? Have we looked at the costs? Have we looked at what cultural tourists are spending versus what it is costing our communities for the local cafe and restaurant where you like to hang out to become the new authentic tourism experience? There are very real costs to this kind of traveler as well. And sometimes we're making assumptions that budget travelers, for example, the ones we know that visit Amsterdam, for example, sometimes we make assumptions that this kind of tourist is not the appropriate one. But can we not encourage these kinds of visitors to flow differently through a destination, to spend more money on local businesses? Can we educate them to understand their impacts and to perhaps reduce them? Why not? Why can't we tap into different kinds of tourists and think about how we proactively manage the different kinds of visitors we have coming to our destinations? The point is that it's actually quite complicated, isn't it? There's not a simple answer. There's not a simple marketing strategy that can solve this problem. But what we need is a different understanding and perhaps a different definition of what quality tourism means. NBTC did this by asking what is actually quite a radical question in a way: why do we want tourism? And this puts the question back on you, the residents, the local businesses, to really think about what is it that we want from tourism, and how is it that we can make sure that tourism is providing benefits to us and not just costs. And if we do this, and we really think about connecting the idea of quality to the true identity of a community, we can start to understand what people value. So of course, jobs and amenities and thriving communities are important, a sense of place, connection with the outside world. Sustainable tourism does not need to be anti-growth. In fact, it can be quite positive, of course, we all know that. But at the same time, we need to pay attention to the concerns that people have about tourism and start to reduce the very real impacts that are taking place in communities: congestion, costs to the way of life, and start to dig into the costs of doing this sort of business. So it's very likely that a destination will need a balance of different types of tourists in order to deliver the anticipated benefits. Where tourists stay, the choices they make, what activities they do, the accommodations they choose, what they buy, all of these decisions affect the range of positive benefits and negative impacts that they bring to a destination. We recently did a study of tourism on an island in the Mediterranean. I can't share which one, but it's a good example, I promise. And we did a market segmentation study where we looked at demand and evaluated not the usual sort of market mix and looking at sort of demand versus opportunity, but we looked at different segments to analyze the costs and benefits that they brought to this destination. We found some information that perhaps is not surprising, but really validates the themes that we're talking about here today. So hotels tend to generate more revenue and more jobs in a destination than short-term apartments and holiday rentals. But those holiday rentals are often much more beneficial for local businesses, for micro-enterprise development, for entrepreneurship, and for diversifying livelihoods among residents. We also found that tourists in the 5-star hotels were spending much more per day on average. So that's a normal indicator that we would look at. But when we got down to it, those that were staying in 1 to 2-star apartments were spending much more in local businesses, in local bars, visiting local restaurants, and visiting local shops. So finding an optimal market mix is actually what we think will make sense to maximize the benefits and minimize the negative impacts that destinations are facing, attracting a range of tourists is what's needed, and will also make the visitor economy more resilient to any potential challenges that come from source markets. The emphasis here is really looking at quality tourism versus quality tourists. So let's figure out what is the right mix for a destination. Let's look closely at our own identity and understand what are the benefits and the costs of different markets. Let's avoid assumptions of undesirability. So in addition to looking at the budget traveler and the potential that they have for destinations, what about visitors to national parks? Do they cover their costs? In fact, the answer is often not. Visitors to national parks typically do not pay their own way. Should they therefore be discouraged from visiting national parks? Or can we rethink the way that they visit our destinations and find ways that we can recoup the costs and make the proper investments that we need in conservation and infrastructure? Quality tourism, rather than quality tourists, moves the emphasis from strictly marketing to management, to attracting the right kinds of tourism for your destination, and then to ensuring that the proper kind of investment, thinking, innovation goes toward managing the destination's assets and ensuring that destinations have what it takes to manage the way people flow through their communities, their behaviors, the burdens they create, and carefully considers issues around the capacity that we have in places, the product that we need to innovate in our communities, and understanding very clearly what are the risks so that we can make the proper investments to mitigate those risks. So again, quality tourism instead of quality tourists. So what needs to change? Well, fundamentally, the whole thing needs to change. The model of how we manage tourism needs to be different. The mindset that we use to manage tourism needs to change. There needs to be the right mandate in place, so the right incentives, the right targets, the right policies and regulations with checks and balances, and the residents absolutely need to be at the table with their voices heard, not simply the typical lip service where we go out and we do a couple of surveys and we think we understand. The residents need to have a voice in protecting their community and designing what tourism should look like as a host. We need private and public sector to collaborate. Of course, we always say that, right? We need public-private partnerships. But genuinely, we need to have public and private sector together at the table, agreeing, using common frameworks, and agreeing what are the risks? What are the opportunities? How do we innovate? We can't, without that kind of negotiation, we will not solve the problems because everyone has their own agendas. So we need to come together, agree to what the principles are of managing places, understand the risks, and together come up with new solutions. Of course, we need money. We need funds. Tourism has to cover its costs. Right now, tourism does not cover costs in destinations, even those invisible ones. And so it's important that we take stock of revenue that's being generated and understand more transparently how we can fund the very real innovations and solutions that are needed in places. And I think this means thinking differently about how money flows through a destination and how the money that we're already receiving is being allocated. We need innovation. I think that there are solutions to our problems that we haven't even dreamed about. The problem is we're not solving the right root issues. We're not looking at the problem in the right way, and we don't have the right people at the table. So I believe that we have to look at the underlying problems, really understand the burdens, the risks, and the opportunities for growth, and to get the right people at the table to start dreaming about the solutions that are going to help our communities grow. We need to build capacity. Another thing we say all the time, yes, we need training, we need new capacities. But really, if tourism is changing and the way we manage tourism is changing, then we absolutely need to be thinking differently about the kinds of people that are managing it. And they need different kinds of skills. We can't go back and use old models and apply them to new solutions. People that work in tourism need to have new skills brought to the table and new conversations that can help them drive that innovation. And we need good information and data. It's another thing we say all the time, right? Has anyone here ever not heard that before? Right? We need data. But we don't just need data. We need smart information, and we need good data that helps us think about tourism as a business. We need data that helps us understand the costs, understand the impacts, understand the potential interventions, and start to make really smart strategic business decisions about managing tourism. And we can't do that without common data frameworks and information. But I would caution that that doesn't mean we need to collect more and more and more and more data, because sometimes we're drowning in data and we don't know what to do with it. We need to find the right data, the right indicators, and be smart about using that data for good. So, who's already doing this? I was asked to provide examples and to provide a global context. The fact is, there are pockets of good practice all around the world. We hear good things coming out of New Zealand. They've introduced tourism tax, and they're funneling, money to good projects. The Balearic Islands have been raising a lot of money for needed infrastructure and earmarking that money for change. So there are good examples. But I must say the Netherlands is leading, and with Perspective 2030, the Netherlands is at the vanguard, with only a handful of others who have made a clear statement about the need and the desire to manage tourism better. But sustainability means going all in for the long run. This is generational change we're talking about. And that is not easy. And it takes vision, and it takes perseverance. But we can't have quick fixes. We can't expect changes to happen tomorrow or next week or maybe even next year. We need to commit. Think about 10 to 20-year horizons, maybe even longer. Think about how to protect tourism for the next generation and incrementally monitor whether we are on the right path. The reward is that tourism will be adding value to the Netherlands for generations to come, supporting local amenities, providing jobs, benefiting conservation, helping infrastructure, and promoting a sense of place for the Dutch people without leaving behind any burdens, invisible or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Very compelling case you make for moving from the question of quality tourists to quality tourism. Sadly, we only have time for one question here in the plenary setup, but okay. I'd like to ask you, you stress a number of points, right? We need innovation, we need data, et cetera, et cetera. We're here together with pretty much everyone who's anyone in the industry. What would you recommend? What's the biggest topic to tackle having everybody in this room today? What's the first thing we should address to make a big step forward?
Yeah. It's interesting because I closed my presentation by saying we can't have quick fixes, and then everyone wants to know, what do we do tomorrow? But we do need to start somewhere. And I think the key is that we start to have a much clearer picture and understanding of the burdens, the risks, the costs. I think that probably everyone in this room lives in a community where you could start to define what are your assets of tourism. And I'm not just talking about the typical ones. We all know what are our hotels, what are our attractions, what are the typical, but what are all the assets that tourism needs to survive? What is the infrastructure, right? What are the natural resources? And start to just make a list, really. Let's define, what are these assets? Who manages them? What's going on with them? What are the risks that these assets are facing? And start to bring the community together to come to some common understanding of what we mean by the invisible burden, or even the visible burden, because some of these burdens are very real and concrete. And I think this means bringing everyone together around this sense of agreeing on assets, looking very carefully at what are the biggest risks that we face, and starting right away the process of innovating and determining which interventions are most needed to start tomorrow, because there are some quick things that I think can be addressed in any community that will start to bring everyone, I think, along the same page and working together to innovate and chase the funding that we all need to make this long-term change.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Jeremy Sampson.